I'm Louis Falgu, and welcome to the Music Breakdown. And today I've got something very exciting for everybody. I'm going to be taking a look at the discography of an essential progressive rock band, Genesis. Now, I've been personally obsessed with Genesis for like half a year now, and I just couldn't wait to talk about their discography. I think one of the most interesting things about this band's discography is that it really does feel like it's split in two halves. People talk about it as though there's the Peter Gabriel era and the Phil Collins era. But you could also separate it into the prog era and the pop era. Because what this band may be most commonly known for is the pop rock material and the chart-topping hit material that they produced in the 80s. But the band is mainly known among music enthusiasts as a progressive rock group from the 70s. And so we'll begin with the band's debut album, From Genesis to Revelation.
We're waiting for you. Come and join us now.
So in 1969, a band made up of at least half college friends and associates put out a completely unknown at the time, completely passed over, completely overlooked, completely irrelevant album entitled From Genesis to Revelation. At this time, the band was made up of Anthony Phillips, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Peter Gabriel, and John Silver. The funny thing about this debut is that it really doesn't actually hint towards anything that would come later in Genesis's discography. This is essentially a imitation of various 60s psychedelic pop groups. And really, it could fit in as just some unheard of, irrelevant album from that era, which is essentially what it is. Now, at this time, the band actually viewed Anthony Phillips as their frontman and their leading mind, which is really interesting because, I mean, he is the guitarist here, but Peter Gabriel is singing all of the songs. In general, the songs that are on this album are incredibly boring. In fact, on the whole, this album is a snooze fest. You're really getting just a number of very dull and uninteresting psychedelic pop tunes that aren't even particularly hooky, really. The production is really, really bad. I mean, the recording of the instruments isn't very good. On the track, in the beginning, there's these awful phaser effects. And the band's producer on this album, Jonathan King, insisted on sweetening up their sound by adding orchestrations. These orchestrations are really just like slathering icing on top of a remarkably dull cake. But the problem is the icing doesn't even really fit. Like, a lot of these string sections and horn sections just kind of sound like they're lifted out of other tunes, which isn't to say that they don't, like, melodically fit in with the songs they're in, but they're produced better. Like, they sound better than the band does, and it's very awkward. I think songs like In the Wilderness, Where the Sour Turns to Sweet, and One Day are fine, and are probably the only moments on this record where I think the additional instrumentation actually complements the songs. In the Wilderness and One Day in particular sounding very joyous in their choruses. But many of these other songs are just terribly underwritten. They don't have particularly good lyrics, they don't have good hooks, they don't really have good verses, the singing is okay. I mean, just in general, it feels like a really mediocre performance. Now, when the album came out, it didn't even sell 1,000 copies. And really, it deserves to be forgotten. I mean, sure, it's kind of interesting as like a relic because it was technically Genesis's debut, and maybe you want to hear it for that reason, but the thing is, again, it doesn't really hint towards anything later in their discography, and it just doesn't come across as something that is worth hearing in any way. And were it not for the amazing things the band would do later, it's just an album that's incredibly easy to write off.
About to begin, tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams and light up your body with anger.
So Trespass is what the band themselves consider to be their debut, and it's really not hard to see why, because unlike From Genesis to Revelation, this album actually does show a lot of hints of what would come later, and really it is actually a progressive rock album. I mean, by this point, in their second album here, they actually are a progressive rock band. The lineup stayed mostly the same, except now the drummer is John Mayhew, but the actual sound of this album is considerably different. And it really is on every single level. Like, while you can make the connection that Anthony Phillips is still playing guitar, he's playing it much more classically. I mean, the songs in general feel much more classical and much more composed. And of course, the song structures are much longer and more winding and more complex. The opening track, Looking for Someone, is a great start to the Genesis career, really. Featuring these anthemic chorus sections with lots of exciting drum fills, some great organ work, and just in general an exciting opening to the album. But the song does feel kind of aimless at certain points throughout its runtime. I don't think it has the most satisfying progression. However, the best moments on this track really do make everything else fall into place. It's just that this one flaw in this song is kind of spread across the entire record. Most of the songs here are pretty long, but they really don't deserve to be. And that's one, because I don't think they provide good enough musical sections to make the whole thing worth it. I don't think they really feel particularly climactic at any point that make the time feel worth it. And in general, a lot of the time it just kind of feels like the band's just coasting along and playing very well, but not really playing anything that's all that ear-catching. Like, tracks 2 to 5 on this album are honestly kind of dull. They have their moments. I mean, I would say that White Mountain has pretty cool lyrics, and, Visions of Angels has some kind of nice climaxes. They don't really go nearly far enough, but they're pretty. And Stagnation has some good melodic sections. I mean, it has some solid parts, but in general, you just kind of wonder why the songs keep going for as long as they do. And they're not even like that long. They just don't have very satisfying song structures. The best track on this album is the closing track, The Knife, which went on to become a fan favorite pretty fast. The band utilized it in their live shows regularly. And it's really not hard to see why. Like, in the context of this album, it really blows most of the other tracks out of the water. It's like by far the most exciting and heaviest moment on the record, and it actually sounds a lot more like the sound Genesis used on later albums. The first bit of this song is just fantastic. There are these quick galloping rhythms that Peter Gabriel sings really quickly on top of to follow along with. And just in general, the playing really rocks. It's really on point. But when you get to everything after this point, there are still a lot of really good moments. There's this really slow build into this heavier riff that happens. And there's also a guitar solo. But the thing is, I just kind of feel like it gets pretty aimless structure-wise. So it does have a similar problem to the other tracks. It's just that the moments that work are much more exciting and memorable. And it does make for a satisfying conclusion to this album that was otherwise mostly kinda dull. Now look, I'm not trying to knock the album completely. I mean, this is definitely much better than From Genesis to Revelation, and it does feel much more like a debut. If this were their first album, it would make a lot more sense. I mean, so I understand why the band kind of considers it to be that. It shows a lot of potential. I just don't think the band really realized that with this record. But overall, it's fine, and I think it's worth listening to after you've heard their classic records to kind of see where they came from.
Trying to find a needle in a haystack. Chilly wind, you're piercing like a dagger, it hurts me so. Hey, nobody needs to discover me.
So after Trespass, the band lost who they considered to be their main member, Anthony Phillips, who got stage fright from the growing popularity of the band and just dipped. And they really expected that to be the end of the band, but thankfully it wasn't, and the band ended up picking up guitarist Steve Hackett and drummer Phil Collins, who finally complete the classic Genesis lineup. And what's so amazing about this album in particular is that lineup shines from the moment this thing starts. There was no better way for Genesis to show what they could do than opening this album with one of the greatest progressive rock songs of all time, as well as one of the greatest album openers of all time, The Musical Box. On this song, every single band member is absolutely killing it, and the band finally ends up sounding like that classic Genesis. The Musical Box in general is just a stellar fucking song. The song is about a literal musical box that, when played, ends up releasing a spirit who longs for the contact of a woman. And the way this song progresses is just incredible. It opens on this mysterious and solemn section of Peter Gabriel's voice with some incredible keyboard work. I mean, everything's really subtle here, but it's so mysterious. It builds this incredible atmosphere. until the band works its way into an incredible section where the band just shreds. I mean, it is goddamn awesome. Like, the way it comes in, the way it builds up, and the way it finally climaxes, it's insane. And Steve Hackett's guitar playing in this section is just mind-blowing. It's so amazing. The band brings things back down again, and then brings things back up again in an even more exciting climax that results in one of the most exciting moments of Genesis's entire career. But for my money, the best bit of the song is what happens after this, as the spirit asks the woman to touch him now. And it's just got this joyous, ceremonious build and climax at the end of this song. It just puts a smile on my face and makes me cry tears of joy. And I think the song is just a really incredible way to tackle the theme of sexual repression and desire. Now that song is over 10 minutes long, and the album also contains two other grand prog epics in the form of The Return of the Giant Hogweed and The Fountain of Salmacis. The Return of the Giant Hogweed being this really silly story about the giant hogweed plant taking its revenge on England and trying to kill everyone. And of course, this story just happens to be super goofy, but the band is totally aware of it. And musically, it allows for that comical element to shine, while still actually being kind of aggressive and awesome. The keyboard work in this song in particular is just amazing, especially in the second half, which is the Dance of the Giant Hogweed section, where there's just some incredible piano work by Tony Banks. And unlike the long songs on Trespass, it should be clear already that the long songs on this album are just structured in a far more satisfying way. And the band in general is just way more creative here. The Fountain of Salmacis is a mythical tale. The song is pretty epic, especially being about mythology, and it contains an incredible section where the band just really lets loose at one point. God, Phil Collins' drumming on that bit too is amazing. I don't think the song is one of their better epics, but it's definitely pretty damn cool. So these three songs are great. Like, it finally shows Genesis as Genesis, I think. This is where the potential that I said they showed on Trespass is finally getting capitalized on. However, I think where Nursery Cryme really starts to falter is in the other songs here. Because the album has three really long songs and then shorter tracks in the middle, that you have to kind of find a way how to structure that coherently. And I just really don't think the band managed to hit that mark. In general, the flow in this album is just very weak. Like, it's not that the other songs are bad necessarily, although Harold the Barrel is terribly obnoxious. But other than that, the other songs here are actually quite good. It's just that they don't really flow from track to track super well. The long songs just stand out so much here, and the other songs aren't quite great enough, nor do they really ebb and flow throughout the album enough to stand out in any major way. Seven Stones has some nice dramatic moments and some great mellotron work. For Absent Friends is a really nice short folk tune that paints a really great lyrical picture, and it's also sung by Phil Collins, which you let the guy who just joined your band have a song. That's pretty cool. You know, aside from Harold the Barrel, I like these songs. The songs just come and go. The album doesn't really flow. It doesn't feel like one whole unit. And it's not even like the band didn't think about this. I mean, hell, Harlequin actually subtly flows into the Fountain of Salmacis, so they clearly thought about album flow. I just personally don't think they hit that mark here. But yeah, I mean, the three prog epics on this album are definitely worthwhile, and in general, I think Nursery Cryme is the moment where Genesis becomes Genesis, and it is pretty awesome. Okay, so on Nursery Cryme, the band had begun to capitalize on their potential, but on Foxtrot, they capitalize on it in the best way possible. This album is almost just as quirky as Nursery Cryme. It still has that characteristic Genesis feeling and gives them a pretty unique sound. That, coupled with the fact that every instrumentalist in this band is incredible, and Peter Gabriel is an enigmatic and amazing vocalist. So all of those elements are absolutely on full display on this record, and for my money, Foxtrot is their best album. The album opens on the grand and immense Watcher of the Skies, a song that follows the titular Watcher of the Skies as he watches over Earth and questions it. The lyrics on this song are actually kind of heartbreaking. It's beautiful in a way. And the music itself on this song follows this incredible 6/4 rhythm with one of Peter Gabriel's most fun and bouncy vocal performances. And the dynamics of this song are just so good. The band just keeps getting louder and quieter, and the softer moments and the louder moments complement each other so well. In general, it is a wonderful opener. We then follow into the beautiful song Timetable. The imagery on this song is so incredible. It almost makes you nostalgic for medieval times. It's very strange how it manages to do that. And the dynamics on this song, again, are just stellar. The launch into the chorus is really climactic both times it comes around, where Peter Gabriel sings some pretty philosophical lyrics. It's just great. And at the end of these choruses, you get these beautiful toy piano solos where the melodies just keep rising and rising, and they feel like it's infinite, especially since the song fades out on the last one. I mean, this is just a gorgeous song. It's such a great come down after Watcher of the Skies. I mean, the flow of this album in general is incredible. And then after the fade out to this generally softer song, Get 'Em Out by Friday just slams into it. The opening to this song does wonders for the pacing of this album. And goddamn, this song is stellar. It is the story song, essentially, of this album, with Peter Gabriel doing the character voices. This time, the story revolves around the process of winkling, which was when landlords in the UK were both bribing and raising the rent on tenants to get tenants to move out of properties so that the landlords could then sell those properties at higher values. We go back and forth between the landlord character, the winkler, and then the tenants. And while the song is a satire, it has a silliness to it, especially towards the end. It's actually kind of heart-wrenching, like just the knowing that this kind of thing happened and listening to the way that Peter Gabriel is criticizing it and commentating over it. It actually kind of oddly pulls at the heartstrings, even though the conclusion of the song results in genetic control forcing humans to be under 4 feet so that they can fit more people into the properties. Just what an incredible satire this song is. I really can't get enough of it. That then leads us into Can Utility and the Coastliners, which is, again, phenomenal. This song manages to do more in the span of about 6 minutes than most songs could do in like 13 or more. It just packs so many builds and climaxes into its runtime, and all of them are amazing. And just in general, the last leg of this song just packs so much excitement in. It's amazing. Like, this song just blows me away. And it's just so much fun too. Side 2 opens with the stunning classical guitar piece by Steve Hackett, Horizons. This piece is drop dead gorgeous. Like, it just evokes such amazing medieval imagery. It's unbelievably good. And it also serves as an amazing introduction to what has become my favorite song of all time, Supper's Ready. Now, Supper's Ready is essentially a sidelong composition here. Technically it isn't because of Horizons, but it's 23 minutes. And an album like this can often have the problem where it feels kind of lopsided, but I really don't think Foxtrot has this issue. Like, the flow of this album has been so perfect up to this point, and has led up to this point so incredibly, that Supper's Ready just flows naturally from everything else and just feels like a part of the album as opposed to the main centerpiece, in my view anyway. And now, as amazing as the other tracks on this album are, Supper's Ready is so phenomenal, is so stellar, is so spectacular that it puts the other songs to shame. It is a perfectly structured suite with every single movement being goddamn breathtaking in its own way. It opens with the movement Lover's Leap, which is just such a dramatic and striking way to open this suite. It really makes you feel like some sort of massive apocalypse is on the horizon. It's like the calm before the storm, but that calm is very menacing. The lyrics in this song, I mean in this entire album, but on this song in particular, are just magnificent. There's this instrumental passage that leads out of Lover's Leap, which just leaves me in a trance every time, until it expertly leads into the second movement, the Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man. which has this like incredible harmony of this high-pitched voice over Peter Gabriel's voice that is an eargasm. And this movement is the perfect way to start to introduce the drums and get you more situated into the song. It's not quite as raucous as the next movement is, but it leads you into the feel and atmosphere that this song is going to continue to create. The next movement, Ichnaton and Itzakon and their band of merry men, just slams its way into this song with these amazing snare rolls and descending keyboards. It's glorious, and it really kicks the song into high gear, which is something it really needed at this point. This is followed up by a transcendent Steve Hackett guitar solo, which is just fucking stunning. And this gives way to the quiet and meditative movement, How Dare I Be So Beautiful, which just sounds amazing, and it's packed with so much emotion and, again, just phenomenal imagery. And this movement is stacked up against this weird and wacky movement, Willow Farm, and the way it transitions into that is rather iconic, with Peter Gabriel saying, "A flower?" until the band just busts back in. And like the chord progression it goes into is just so ugly, and like it's so stark. Like the contrast between these two sections really puts them both into perspective, and somehow it makes them both work even better. Willow Farm is just a blast. Like, it's totally wacky. It's what I love about Genesis. And Peter Gabriel's vocal performance on this section is just wild. It's so memorable. This gives way to this terrifying little drone until eventually the band builds into Apocalypse in 9/8. The groove on this movement, which is in 9/8, is spectacular. Like, it starts off a little bit less impactful, but it slowly rises in intensity until you start to realize just how incredible and powerful and dramatic it actually is. And on top of this slowly building groove, Tony Banks gives a keyboard solo, which is face-melting. And I didn't previously think it was possible for a keyboard solo to be face-melting, but this one is. And this gives way to an incredible climax where Peter Gabriel just has one of the most amazing moments of his entire career with Genesis, with these powerful and striking lyrics that call upon 666. It is kind of devilish, but it's awe-inspiring, and that leads into the final movement, As Sure as Eggs is Eggs, which is mind-blowing. It's just transcendent. It just takes me to another world. The sound the band managed to create on this movement, which is essentially a reprise of the Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man, just with new lyrics. I mean, the sound here is heavenly. It's God tier. And a lot of that is because of both the keyboard work and also Steve Hackett's just transcendental playing. It's like, you have to hear it to believe it. And because it reprises the second movement, the lyrics end up having even more emotional potency. Like, it just brings me to tears. Like, it's so beautiful, I just can do nothing but cry. And the vocal melody in this section is just out of this world. The final lyric of this movement, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, has returned to lead his children home, to take them to the New Jerusalem. What a powerful set of lyrics, and the way that Peter Gabriel sings it, the way his voice cracks, the imperfections in the way that he sings this just brings out so much emotion. And Steve Hackett fills this out with a guitar solo that is otherworldly. I can't even describe how amazing it is. And yes, I've talked at length about this song, there's so much to say, but that's because it's unbelievable. And again, even though it completely outshines everything else, the other material here is still phenomenal. Like, that's how good of a song this is, and that's how good of an album this is. I know that it's not necessarily a common choice to pick Foxtrot, but this is really just a personal favorite of mine, and I really do think that the band was at their creative peak here. There are ways they would peak later, but creatively, I think this is the peak. This album is just so creative, it's just brimming with creativity out of every single note, and quirkiness as well. Like, this album is, I could talk more about it, but I've talked enough. It's amazing, and yes, it is my favorite Genesis album.
Like the river joins the ocean at the junction.
So now we get to what is commonly considered the band's magnum opus, Selling England by the Pound. This album to me really represents Genesis at their most pristine. The band, by this point, had refined every single element of their sound down to a T. And in general, it's a much more polished album. The production on this thing is fucking pristine. The playing is just consistently on point. Like, everybody's playing better than they ever had. The production's better than it ever had been, that sort of thing. It just, in general, it just feels like such a refined version of the band's sound. This album opens with the jaw-dropping Dancing with the Moonlit Night, opening with the brief Selling England by the Pound bit, which sets the stage so remarkably well and has some subtly political lyrics as well. It eventually gives way into the again, the song's just blitzing. This song has like so many incredible moments packed into it. Like, it just feels like it keeps throwing amazing ideas at you, one after the other, non-stop. The chorus of this song is so celebratory, and it then launches into these heavy, intense, and blitzing sections of music with amazing playing from everyone on all fronts. After the first one of these sections, it goes into this glorious choir, and it sounds so massive and amazing as Peter Gabriel's singing over this. Like, this song is just stellar, and it's such a phenomenal opening track to this album. I Know What I Like comes next, which actually was a minor hit, and it's a much poppier song with a super hooky chorus, but like the way the chorus is laden with the synths, it sounds huge. And I just love this song. It's one of the goofier moments on the album, which is something that Genesis tends to excel at. And yeah, the chorus is so hooky. This leads into the unbelievably good Firth of Fifth. The band just keeps firing off some of the best progressive rock songs of all time, like, seriously. This song has such an amazingly satisfying progression, it's just glorious. The main song bits of this track are, like, just so impactful and so, like, deep and heavy, but melodic as well. The way the band builds and releases these climaxes is just masterful. Tony Banks' solo section on this track is like unbelievable, and it's so joyous too when it comes in with the synth. And that leads into the ethereal and just, how do I even describe it? It's like mystic. This mystical Steve Hackett solo, which is just so chilling. And it's so simple too. He's not like shredding or doing anything ridiculous. It's just this slow and gradual build, and it just keeps climaxing moment after moment. The progression of this solo is like, it's mind-blowing. And when the track gets back into the main song, it's just awesome. I mean, it's just a masterful song. Seriously, it's so beautiful. The other two epics on this album are the Battle of Epping Forest and the Cinema Show. The Battle of Epping Forest just being this crazy and, fucking wild song with tons of time signature changes and just wild fuckery all around. It is insane. And the playing on it is so tight. It's the goofy story song on this album, this time being about a gang rivalry that ended in everyone being dead. Yeah, not exactly funny on paper, but I think the way that Gabriel comments on this is definitely humorous and bitingly satirical, again, and just phenomenal. This one, he's switching characters like even more wildly than on the other songs that are like this, and also the song is shifting musical sections so much that it becomes hard to keep track of, but this song just is so wonderfully happy. Even though the topic is definitely very sad, the sound of this song just puts a big stupid grin on my face. And when the battle is over and everyone's dead, the Black Cap Baron tosses a coin to determine who was the winner. The Cinema Show is wonderful. It's essentially the closer here. It's pretty much paired with Isle of Plenty because it just fades into Isle of Plenty. Cinema Show opens with this Romeo and Juliet love story. It's so beautiful. This entire section is just played so well, it's so nice, and it's so lovely. When in the second half of the song, it gives way to an actually really intense and complex rhythm, where Phil Collins' drumming, by the way, is insane. Like, it's so goddamn amazing. And Tony Banks' keyboard work on this bit is unbelievable. This section manages to pair this intensity with sheer beauty, and the way it transitions between the two and contrasts the two only makes that beauty all the more impactful. And even though the rhythm stays pretty consistent, it still manages to find climaxes and ebbs and flows throughout its runtime. I don't necessarily think that like every single melodic bit of this part is incredible. Some are weaker than others, but when it does climax in those moments that it does climax, it's wonderful, it's so beautiful. And Isle of Plenty ends up reprising the beginning of the album, which is such a great way to close the thing. So yeah, I mean, Selling England by the Pound, it is a masterful album in so many ways, especially technically, but also just the way that it all comes together. Like, this album in general just feels so decisively English. And sure, so did earlier Genesis work, but this album even more than those, which would be fitting given the title. It's also more universally political, and I think it comments pretty subtly but very smartly on the politics and the economic landscape of the time. And I mean, in so many ways, I can totally see why this is a ton of people's favorite. If I had to get a little nitpicky, I would say this album doesn't flow super well. The flow idea in the track listing here is a fundamentally good one. Balance out the long and epic tracks with shorter and more melodic, softer, maybe catchier songs so that the album ebbs and flows. It's a great idea, it's worked on countless other albums, should work here, but I kind of feel like the band doesn't do it super well. Like the actual flow between the endings of some tracks and then the beginnings of the next one don't always feel supernatural. It's not bad by any means, but the album just kind of flows. It doesn't really flow super well, it doesn't really flow super bad, it just kind of goes from track to track. However, all the material that is here is super good, and I mean, wow, just what a masterpiece.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card she plays for tune. Echoes of the Broadway Everglades.
The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway would come to be the final Genesis album with Peter Gabriel a part of the band. And it's also their longest album and their only double album. And it also happens to be a rock opera concept album. The album tells the story of a New Yorker named Rail who gets transported into a dream world where he then tries to find his brother John. It is a strange concept that on paper sounds kinda stupid, but my god, the way that this story plays out, the lyrics, I mean the way the album plays out, it's fantastic! I'm gonna say for my money that The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is the best rock opera, or the best one I've heard anyway. This album is really unique in the Genesis catalog. I mean, it definitely has the fundamental Genesis aesthetic intact, but it does a lot of things different. For one thing, this album is supposed to sound more American compared to the incredibly English sound of the previous album. I mean, taking place in New York, it's bound to do that, I think. This album retains fantasy elements, but they're put into the context of a dream world, so it just feels a lot more abstract and hazy. And in general, the production and sound of this album is also more hazy. And the production of this album isn't as good as Foxtrot or Selling England by the Pound, but it serves the album really well. The flow from track to track here is immaculate, also throughout the entire record, and it ends up doing something really interesting through the course of its runtime. In the first disc of the album, almost every single track is a song, and a lot of them are pretty hooky, they're more traditionally prog, it feels more like what Genesis fans would have been used to up to this point, but now put into the context of this really bizarre story. And also there are just more songs and they're generally shorter than the albums before it. The album opens on the awesome title track, which sets the stage so well, especially lyrically, which then goes into Fly on a Windshield, where, again, the imagery on this song is just amazing, and like the sound of it really puts you in the place of Rail. When he says, "I'm hovering like a fly waiting for the windshield on the freeway," the band then kicks in and you just imagine a fly getting hit by a windshield on the freeway. Or you imagine Rail floating and then getting slammed into a dreamscape because there's like a wall that's coming towards him. The way that the sonics of the song match with the imagery of the lyrics is fucking brilliant. That goes into the amazing Broadway melody of 1974, which really starts to highlight the dreamier and more abstract elements by naming off a bunch of celebrities, but like doing weird things. And from this point on, you are in the dream world. And man, things just get crazy. I will go so far as to say that side 2 of this album, not disc 2, but side 2 is one of the best sides in all of rock music. Like, what an amazing fucking side of music. Opening with the amazing Back in New York City with an interesting time signature and melodic passage in the keyboard. The lyrics here are amazing, with Rael seeing his home life and the way he's lived up to this point and kind of reflecting on it within the context of this dreamscape. But as this song goes along, it slowly and gradually builds instrumentation until it just becomes stellar. Like, the climaxes on this song are unbelievably good. It just gets so mind-blowing. That follows into the beautiful instrumental Hairless Heart, which goes into the goofy, poppy song Counting Out Time, which I just adore, where Rael explores his sexuality in a very silly way. And then there's the beautiful The Carpet Crawlers, with some of the best imagery in the entire album, and it's a really meditative track. It doesn't have much dynamics, but it really doesn't need it. Like, it's just so breathtaking. Now, once you get into side 2 of this album, both the story and like the flow of the record become more abstract and hazy and dreamlike. For one thing, the songs are not nearly as bite-sized or digestible as the songs in the first disc. Things get a lot more long-winded. There are way more instrumental interludes. In fact, pretty much all of the songs are separated with an instrumental track. Some of these instrumental tracks like have lyrics, but barely any. They're mostly instrumental. And you know, you would think that the album ends up feeling really lopsided, but it actually works wonders because it starts to make the album feel dreamier, and it gets more abstract and meditative and weird as it goes along, which is so perfectly matching to the story. You get a track where Rael has sex with lamias, which are snake women, and then proceeds to eat them. Tracks where weird slipper men, who are like these grotesque creatures, are surrounding Rael as he kind of like contemplates as to whether he sees himself in them or not. Like, things just get fucking strange, and it's so cool. I do want to specifically call out the Lamia because that is a beautiful song with, again, amazing dynamics, and it's just so, like, God, it's so amazing. And that's followed up by the instrumental piece Silent Sorrow and Empty Boats, which it's jaw-dropping. I mean, it's incredible. And that track especially, but really all of these instrumental pieces do such a good job of like telling you the story purely through sound. I mean, you can actually follow the events that are supposed to be occurring throughout these instrumentals just by listening to them, especially Silent Sorrow, which just fills me with emotion every time. When the album gets into its home stretch, it reprises The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway with The Light Dies Down on Broadway, but it's so much more emotional this time around. It is an amazing track. Riding the Scree is a sillier and goofier instrumental that has a really great climax with the keys. And then the final 2 tracks, In the Rapids and It, close things off on a really philosophical note. A very abstract and inconclusive note as well, though intentionally so. It kind of turns out that the whole album was almost like a philosophical self-discovery kind of thing. The final track, It, is super climactic. It's great. But it is inconclusive to the story. If I have like one complaint, I guess it is that, you know, I wish the story was more conclusive. I mean, I understand why it's not, but I don't feel like its inconclusiveness makes it better for it. I do think it's fascinating. I think there's a lot to read into with it. And again, I just love the way this album becomes more abstract and eventually philosophical as it goes along. It's such a different and weird flow for an album and for Genesis, and it makes it just one of the coolest experiences you can have with an album. I mean, you know, the album definitely isn't perfect. There are tracks that are definitely weaker, like Anyway, which has a pretty dull song at its core, although it has an incredible middle section with these booming guitars that ends up making the song overall worth it. So even the weaker tracks add something to the album here. The lyrics on this thing are almost always stellar, except on Anyway, but everywhere else the imagery and lyricism might be the best the band has ever offered. The album flow is also incredible, although, you know, given that it does slow down in the second disc, even though I think it really works, it can maybe make the album feel lopsided. It will do that for some people anyway. You know, and maybe individual tracks don't go super well together, like Riding the Scree comes in a little too goofy, a little too fast after Light dies down, but in general, the flow here is, again, it's pretty fucking masterful. And if my description of this album as being more abstract and dreamlike and kind of philosophical and weird sounds interesting to you, then yes, you will want to hear this album, because it really is an experience, and it is another masterpiece from Genesis. So once Peter Gabriel left the band, I think they probably took that as a pretty big blow. What would it mean to continue on without Peter Gabriel? You know, what would it mean to continue on without the wacky stage antics that the press and fans loved so much from Peter Gabriel? The costumes, the theatricality, all of that stuff. Well, as it turns out, the band didn't really like that so much because it was taking the focus away from them. So maybe now the band could finally start to be recognized for being a band. But the only problem was they had to find a new singer, and hundreds of audition tapes, reportedly anyway, later, they didn't find a singer. So they're like, oh fuck it, Phil Collins, then you do it, because we know you can sing. And so he sang on this album after they'd completed all the instrumentals, although they still hadn't viewed him as the singer at this point. He was just there by necessity. But interestingly, the band plays and writes this album with the confidence of a band that's been going for as long as they have. You don't really get the impression that they don't know what they're doing anymore. What you get is a really solid collection of some tasty prog tracks. Look, the thing is that, in my view, A Trick of the Tail really sounds like the band was mostly out of ideas. And I don't mean to say that the material that the band presents and creates in this album isn't good, because it is very good. Instrumentally, the band is doing great. Phil Collins does a decent job at playing chameleon for Peter Gabriel here, and he ends up, filling the role fine. In fact, I would say his vocal performances are pretty good across this album. But the thing is, it just doesn't really feel like it's brimming with the creativity of earlier releases. In fact, in a way, the creativity kind of just sounds completely sucked dry. The prog tracks here are more bite-sized, and not in the sense that they're shorter, because the tracks are fairly long on this thing, but like, they just, I don't know, they lack some element of grandiosity, they lack the creativity, and they end up relying more on hooks, both melodic and vocal hooks, than previous prog tracks did from the band. And maybe that was the right way to go. It certainly ends up making the songs here pretty sticky, and I think the hooks that they write are strong. The opening track, Dance in a Volcano, is an awesome intro to this album. It has a great intro section in itself that really builds this really cool, intense build for the start of the album that results in the main melodic hook of the track, which is very solid. You know, maybe it's not quite doing enough for me. It could have definitely been more melodic. It does feel a little bit too simple for its own good, but it certainly packs a punch and is very memorable as well. And also, the way that this song progresses, it's just crazy. I mean, the drumming is amazing on it, and it just never really feels like it lets up. The album does a good job flowing from track to track because it pairs these more intense songs with the softer songs, as you generally should. The next track being Entangled, which is very nice, very pretty. I enjoy it a lot. Squonk has an incredible groove, and I feel like if the band were able to make a more satisfying progression of this song could have been stellar. Sadly, I think it kind of just overdoes itself pretty quickly. Not to say that it's ever bad, it's still a good track, I just don't find it that memorable. The only memorable thing is the opening groove, and after that it kind of just coasts, to be honest. Madman Moon is my favorite track on this album. It's super dramatic and emotional, and it results in probably the best climax on the record. I think it's on side 2 where the album starts to falter a little bit because Robbery, Assault, and Battery is just bad. It's basically Phil Collins' attempt at recreating the kind of character stuff that Peter Gabriel was doing on the last few albums, but Phil Collins just is not as enigmatic, he's just not as eccentric, and he's not as versatile. And not to mention, the song they write around it is just really weak prog. It just doesn't really have anything to it. It's not very meaty, it's just kind of goofy and dumb. Ripples is pretty enough. I honestly find it kind of standard. It's weird to say that, I know, because it definitely has a grand sound to it. It's a long song, but I don't know, it just doesn't really go above and beyond for me in any way, and it ends up sounding kind of in the background for me. And also, I just don't think Collins really sells this track, just because I think his voice is a little too plain. The title track is fun, it's got a really catchy hook, and the album ends on the pretty awesome instrumental track Los Endos, where the band kind of reprises some themes. You know, all in all, as an album structure, it's pretty intelligently created, and you know, it's a really strong album. I can see why a lot of people like this album a lot more than I do. This is a favorite of some people, you know, and I mean, I can see it. But to me, it does generally sound like Genesis, with less ideas, less creativity, focusing more on stickier hooks and writing songs that way, giving you a bite-sized, tasty sampling of prog that isn't too prog, and certainly isn't too eccentric or quirky either. However, I still think this is a strong album that shows the band could continue without Peter Gabriel, and you know, perhaps from this point on could continue to get more creative and find new ways to take their sound.
If this desert's all that ever be, then tell me what becomes of me. A fall of rain, there must have been enough blood on the rooftops, too much for me.
So Wind and Wuthering ended up being the last Genesis album with guitarist Steve Hackett, and you can hardly tell because his presence isn't felt on this record, which is part of the reason why he left. The other band members were just kind of rejecting all of his song ideas and didn't end up allowing any of them to come to fruition. I mean, Tony Banks in general just dominates this record. This is possibly their most keyboard-oriented work yet, even though generally Genesis used the keyboard and synths as the primary instrument. Here, it's like really the primary instrument. And so this album does distinguish itself from other albums in the prog era of Genesis, and it distinguishes itself from Trick of the Tail quite greatly, actually. I don't think this album is really that similar to Trick of the Tail. But part of that is because it has even less going for it this time around. While the songs are pretty, I think sometimes even this album has a more relaxing and beautiful sound to it than other prog albums. I mean, one of the big pop tunes on this album, maybe the big one, is Your Own Special Way, which, you know, it's one of their first major pop songs, I would say, where you can kind of tell the direction they were going, and it's such a lovely and pretty little tune. And even the longer prog tracks kind of go that way too. I really like 11th Earl of Mar. I think it's a very exciting opening. It's one of the proggier tracks, much less relaxing, a lot more intense. The instrumental tracks here I think are really solid. And you know, just in general, all around, this is a good release with some good proggy songs and some poppier, simpler moments too. But honestly, it feels like it has even less ideas than Trick of the Tail, because at least a Trick of the Tail kind of made up for its lack of creativity with some really strong songwriting and hooks. Wind and Wuthering doesn't really have that. And also the album flow isn't nearly as smart. They put two of the most epic prog tracks on this album back to back as the opening tracks, which is a really strange decision. Towards the end of the album, it starts to almost feel like it's becoming a suite, with Afterglow closing everything off in a nice way. Maybe too basic. But yeah, and that also again results in the end of this album not being super satisfying. Just in general, the flow is pretty weak. I think the album's nice, I think it has good production, I think there's good performances, the keyboard work is melodic and very nice, it has its somewhat more memorable moments. In general, I forget about this release sometimes, and as the final album with Hackett, it kind of does feel like the end of an era. Sadly, it just doesn't really have the importance or the gravitas that I would hope for an album that would end an era like this. But it's an enjoyable record that's worth checking out if you like Trick of the Tail especially. And yeah, from here on out, the band is going to continue to change in some pretty interesting ways. Well, I say they're going to change in interesting ways, but that's not true on this album, And Then There Were Three, which is a worthless, useless, completely devoid of value album that just exists and nothing else. This album's title announces the fact that the band was now a trio. They'd lost two of their most essential members, Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett, now down to bassist Mike Rutherford, who also takes over as the guitarist, keyboardist Tony Banks, and Phil Collins is the drummer and the singer. And this trio would be Genesis for quite a long time from this point onward, and is also the lineup of Genesis that recorded the songs that are most commonly known. So with an album like this, you would expect Genesis to start to try to find a new sound, and that is what they're doing here, but God, it sounds like it. This album is such a snooze fest. Like, every track here is just weak. It just has no impact, it's so forgettable. It's not quite pop rock yet, it's kinda prog rock. I mean, it's kind of a mixture of both. There's a little bit of pop rock here, but like in general, Mike Rutherford's guitar playing isn't characteristic in any way, certainly different than Steve Hackett, whose guitar playing was really unique and incredible. Mike Rutherford's just serviceable. The songs they write are fairly standard for the most part. They do write longer, proggier tracks, although they tend to kind of suck. I really would go through the songs here, but there's not too many that's worth saying anything about, unless I want to go negative and say that Scenes from a Night's Dream is one of the worst tracks the band recorded. It's just so poorly written, and the melodies on this thing are just stupid. The album ends in a song that was a big hit for the band and was ultimately telling of where they would go next, which is Follow You, Follow Me. I would say this is the best song here. I mean, it's kind of standard. It's just okay. It's a pretty simple song. It's effective enough as a little love song, but I mean, it doesn't really stick in my mind too much. I guess the chorus is kind of catchy, and it has stuck in the mind of a lot of people. And I mean, again, it was indicative of where they were going next, and I think, in fact, it actually may have told them where to go next because of how successful the song was. And I guess it's the only track here that's really worth talking about or remembering, because everything else is just so dull. I don't know, I mean, the songwriting isn't generally bad. Again, it's just kind of standard. The playing is kind of standard. None of the choruses really stand out. None of the verses really stand out. Phil Collins as the singer is just okay. Everything about it is just kind of listenable, and that's it. And even then, I wouldn't recommend it because it's really fucking boring. And frankly, I've already spent enough time talking about it, so I'm gonna stop. Duke is an album that caught me completely by surprise. I mean, going through the Genesis discography and hitting And Then There Were Three, it really gets you very upset and kind of depressed about where the band is going to go from then on out. Like, if losing Steve Hackett and Peter Gabriel really caused them to release an album that bland and that boring and that just worthless, then things just can't get better. You know, they're just gonna continue to be this way, but that is not true. This trio found their sound on Duke, and they sound confident of it. The album is assured, it's thematic, it's kind of conceptual. This album is completely composed of themes of loneliness and breakup and heartache. It's actually a really depressed record, but you'd hardly know because half, if not more than half of the songs here are unapologetically bright and melodic, and poppy as well. You see, what Duke does that's so cool and so unique in the band's discography and so special in the band's discography is really blends prog and pop in a really interesting way. Sure, it features just some pop rock songs, such as the wonderful Misunderstanding or Turn It On Again or Alone Tonight, but then it features proggier tracks that are really, they're like pop songs dressed in a prog costume, I guess. The opening track, Behind the Lines, is just great. It opens with these really bright keyboard melodies, and it's very intense, it's very fun, it's very energetic. There's so much energy on this album at certain points. And then this leads into the poppier section of the song, which is the opening to the Duke Suite, which was originally intended to be a whole sidelong composition similar to Supper's Ready, but they ended up splitting up all the movements into different tracks and moved them throughout the record. But unlike with Foxtrot, where Supper's Ready ended up flowing naturally from the other tracks and felt like a natural conclusion to the record, I think that if the Duke Suite were placed at the end of this album, it would end up feeling lopsided because all of the other songs are the simpler, more poppy tracks, and you'd have the one proggy track at the end, and it's also like 20 minutes. And actually having split the movements across the album in the beginning, middle, and end ends up providing extra context to all of the simpler tracks. It actually makes the album flow much better and makes it feel really cohesive. The Duke Suite told a story of a character who was seeking out this celebrity woman to fulfill his own loneliness. And part of the reason why was because he was obsessed with celebrity and TV stars. And this story, again, works to put into context the themes and emotions of the rest of the songs as well. And I will say that even though a lot of the material on this album is fun and upbeat and bright, the emotions that are actually on display here in the lyrics are anything but. This album lyrically is really depressing. Like, it's depressing. It's lonely and it's heart-wrenching. Songs like Heath A's Alone Tonight and Please Don't Ask are very obviously sad, particularly Please Don't Ask, where Collins gets actually really personal. It's worth noting that Collins was going through a divorce around this time, and while he didn't write most of the tracks here, he only writes 2, you can hear in those 2 tracks that he does write, alone anyway, that he was feeling pretty bad. And very lonely as well. It's interesting that all 3 of the band members were able to work around this theme of loneliness and make this album feel like a big breakup album, basically. And I think because the album is so bright in certain moments that its emotional lows hit even harder. I mean, lyrically the whole thing is sad, but when the sound of the song and the lyrics are both sad and they match in that regard, it hits hard. This album ends on the climactic Duke's Travels and Duke's End. Duke's Travels being a great instrumental proggy track with tons of great soloing from Banks, a lot of great little different instrumental sections. It's really exciting, and it climaxes in a reprise of the guide vocal that was towards the beginning of the album. And this reprise is incredible. Like, this is such a climactic and emotional moment that then leads into Duke's End, which reprises the very beginning of the album, bringing the whole thing really full circle. Also, in general, Phil Collins sounds a lot more confident on this record, and he really comes into his own as a vocalist. I'm not crazy about him as a singer during this leg of Genesis' career, but on this album, he is great. He is seriously great. These are songs I just can't imagine Peter Gabriel singing. Like, Collins really works on his own now. He's no longer just trying to kind of imitate Gabriel. And yeah, just in general, this represents a really interesting point in the band's career that sadly they never really rekindled in the same way. Like, Duke is a musical direction this trio could have taken and continued in, and they might have made some even better stuff, but honestly, Duke is one of the band's best albums. It's really strong, and if this is the best that the trio is going to give us, spoiler alert, then I'll take it. Because this album actually stands on its own outside of the Genesis discography as a powerfully emotional album that just works really well as a whole. No doubt about it, it's got its weaker moments. I think the pop sensibility of this band is very good on this album, but it does come with some AOR-isms, I want to say. Like, sometimes the tendency towards pop vocal melodies makes some of the proggier moments not be quite as good or dramatic or intense as they could have been. And other little things like that. You know, the album isn't like perfect, it's not like a masterpiece, but for what it is, it's very strong, and I really do recommend it. So with Duke, the band undoubtedly turned off a lot of their longtime fans, their longtime prog fans, who wanted them to stay prog. Funny enough, Duke definitely had a lot of prog sensibilities, but no doubt about it, it was very clear where the band were going. However, even with that clear direction, Abacab is a mindfuck of an album. Just to even think that it's the same band that made Duke is weird. Like, this is all in on the pop rock direction. And I'm gonna be fair to the band, because I think that in some ways, conceptually, Abacab is actually kind of cool. For one thing, it's the band very obviously trying to be modern, using the modern production technologies of the time, a modernist album art. It's very clear that the band was trying to stay with the times, and they were a little bit ahead of the curve in doing that. It's definitely a powerful statement if this was going to be the album that would transition the band into a new kind of style. But I can't get behind this album at all. Not at all. Oh god, it's really, really bad. For one thing, the selection of songs that the band wrote here is their worst yet. I mean, these songs are crap. Like, pretty much all of them. The title track has some energy to it. The production utterly sucks all of that life out of it. The song itself isn't particularly strong anyway, and it's also needlessly extended for another 3 minutes with some instrumental noodling that isn't even good. But whatever, that's the strongest track this album has to offer, and I don't even like it. No Reply at All has a horn section, which is kind of lively, but the song at the core is dull as shit. And there are these like kind of white people funk little passages that are thrown throughout it that sound fucking terrible. Just throwing a horn section on top of it doesn't suddenly make it a great song. Me and Sarah Jane is just goofy and fucking stupid. I mean, it kind of gets a little bit better towards the end, but god, the core central melody of this song is so dumb sounding. Like, was this love song supposed to sound like a love song for idiots? I don't mean to sound like a total asshole when I say that, but like, if that was the intention going into the song, then actually I might have more respect for it and its choice of melody and rhythm. Keep It Dark has a god-awful melody and groove. Like, I don't even know what they were thinking with this shit. They managed to make it anthemic at certain points, which raises the song from being utterly god-awful, but like, it doesn't really feel particularly earned. The Man on the Corner all the way to Another Record, so like the final 3 songs on this album are just so bland and dull. Like, what is there even of note to say about these songs? Especially Another Record, which is just kind of oddly sleazy. The track Dodo Lurker is probably the most Genesis-y, the most proggy. It's not really prog, but it's a longer tune. It's a little prog, I suppose. But again, like, the writing on this song, the fucking lyrics are god awful. And when it gets into the Lurker section, you get one of the worst synth melodies I've ever heard, and I do not know why the band decided to include it. Was it supposed to sound bad? So I've talked about every song on this album, and I've purposefully avoided one. Because Abacab happens to contain the worst song of Genesis's career. And let me tell you, as you will come to find out with what I have to say about some songs down the line, it's kind of an accomplishment, because there are some horrible songs from here on out. But Who Done It is just beyond the level that any band at this point in their career should ever be willing to stoop to. This song is appalling. It is legitimately one of the worst, most obnoxious, and just generally god-awful songs I have ever heard. Apparently they thought they were writing a punk song? Putting aside the fact that it's not even a punk song, why is that something they thought they could do? Because if they take let's write a punk song and they use that to write this, it's probably a thought they should have never had. The lyrics on this are horrifically repetitive and terrible, and Phil Collins gives the most utterly horrific vocal performance he has ever given. And the song manages to get even more grating and awful as it goes along, and it starts off grating and awful. It's really so bad that it's unforgivable. And it's a blemish on a record that was already really bad. Even if the songs they managed to pen were better than this, the production choices are terrible. Yeah, they were modern, but the modern production choices of this era just managed to suck the life out of so much music. And it definitely sucks the life out of these songs, which didn't have much life to begin with. Everything sounds synthetic, everything sounds dry, it's just really dull. While it's not the worst album ever, Abacab is a confounding and very, very bad record.
Keep it dark. Beyond the silver rainbow.
Now that progression into the pop rock world continues on Genesis's self-titled album. This album is self-titled because all three members of the band worked together to write every song on it, which could have produced good results. I will say it made the band a little bit more willing to experiment. It generally sounds like this album is more adventurous than Abacab in some ways. The opening track, Mama, is this long, extended, and really tense and atmospheric tune. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a pop song, but it's really moody and, experimental for a pop song even. Heavily utilizing this drum machine that sounds like a machine powered by steam or something. It creates a good atmosphere with which the band lays this cool moody foundation, and Phil Collins sings his heart out, which is cool at points and really kind of awful at other points. He does this laugh 2 times throughout the song, which is just garish and awful. There's also some little synth bits that don't work, particularly the one after the first laugh, but I do think the general progression of this song is pretty satisfying and pretty cool. And so it does seem, when you listen to Mama, that this album is going to be more adventurous than Abacab and maybe present some surprises. No. The Genesis self-titled album is even worse than Abacab, in my opinion. There are a few reasons for this. For one thing, Phil Collins has become even more confident as a vocalist, and it actually ends up being a bad thing on this album because he over-sings on every fucking song here. Particularly the soft pop songs, where every time he hits a high note, he just yells his lungs out. It's awful. It takes songs that would already be kind of gross and make me want to gag, and makes them intolerable. I'm namely referring to the song Taking It All Too Hard. There's also the song It's Gonna Get Better, which is also similarly terrible. The album features production that's possibly even more dry and dull and lifeless than Abacab, and this especially hurts on the tracks Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea. You know, Home by the Sea is actually a decent tune. It's not great, but it's fine. But Second Home by the Sea is the continuation of it, and it ruins it. For one thing, this is the band's most lifeless, worthless, and terrible instrumental yet. And that is coupled with the god-awful production, making the already dull and drab instrumental that much worse. There's the song That's All, which relies on a super stilted and kind of grating groove, with Phil Collins overselling the song again. And this album happens to contain another song that really, really competes with Whodunit as the worst Genesis song. If you made Whodunit, you better fucking hope you don't have another song that competes with that as your worst. But Genesis do. And it's Illegal Alien. Oh my god. This song is god-awful in so many ways. For starters, the song at the core is stupid, annoying, and grating. It gets on my nerves so goddamn fast, it wouldn't even matter if I just set aside all of the other things that are terrible about this song, but I can't. It also happens to be very racist, and I'd like to briefly explain why. Even though the song suggests that it's no fun being an illegal alien, which is a stupid and mocking and childish way to talk about the plights of undocumented immigrants, but the band members may be able to defend themselves and say that they're being sympathetic. But if it's sympathetic in the same way you view an insect. The song does nothing but mock and deride immigrants. Phil Collins puts on a faux Mexican accent. Yeah, he actually does that. Makes fun of this immigrant for having a sister who is willing to do prostitution to pay for her way to the States. Which again, yeah, you could say is sympathetic, but he's just making fun of it. Why is the subject of the mockery the immigrant and not the system? Anyway, I could keep going, but yeah, the song's racist. But even if it weren't racist, it's a fucking horrible, stupid song that is ungodly annoying, and I've spent too much time on it. The song Silver Rainbow is almost tolerable. It's just got such garish production. And the song Just a Job to Do I think is supposed to be threatening, but that is a laughable idea. Just in general, this album is an absolute failure. Like, even though it manages to have the better songs in that Mama and Home by the Sea are not bad. They're actually pretty decent. It doesn't even matter, because the other material here is so goddamn awful that it really does kind of put Abacab to shame in some ways. And let it be known that this happens to be Mike Rutherford's favorite Genesis album. What the fuck, dude? So Invisible Touch is the band's best seller. In fact, this album competed, funnily enough, with Peter Gabriel's So for the #1 spot on the charts, which I wonder how that made Gabriel feel. This album produced their most memorable set of hits, the ones that most people probably know, the ones you've probably heard in a grocery store or a shopping mall, or perhaps 80s pop radio in a car if you're into that sort of thing. Look, I don't like this album. This album's got another selection of crap songs with garish 80s production that sucks the life out of everything, Phil Collins occasionally overselling and oversinging some of the songs, though thankfully I think he does a much better job singing over the soft pop tunes here than he did on the self-titled. He actually sings quite nicely and isn't like overdoing it. And the songs are still kind of gross and lame. The song opens on the title track, which is honestly just kind of obnoxious and gets on my nerves pretty damn fast. Tonight, Tonight, Tonight is 8 minutes of absolutely fucking nothing. I don't understand what the point or value of this song could even possibly be. If you want to hear Phil Collins sing terrible lyrics like I'm coming down like a monkey, lyrics that have no actual genuine good meaning to them, then, you know, go for it, I guess. Land of Confusion, which is just pure political pandering, a song that almost nobody is going to politically disagree with. It's not gonna offend anybody. It's not gonna make any kind of statement that's gonna upset anyone. Think about the political songs that Peter Gabriel was writing and how effective and satirical and biting those actually were, and then you listen to this shit. And the song at the core, I don't really like anyway, but it's especially bad with the production that's laden on top of it, sucking the life out of and energy out of the song. Yeah, just in general, I think this album's pretty crap, but I will say, to its credit, it is much better at being a shitty 80s pop album than the last two were. And I guess that's not really a compliment, but it is better than the other two records. Like, aside from Tonight, 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 I can't exactly say that these songs are really terrible. I mean, they're just bad. They're bad 80s pop tunes, but they were effective, and look, they managed huge hits with this album, so clearly they were doing something right, I guess. And maybe this album in some ways has more merit as an 80s pop album than the last two did. It doesn't feature a god-awful song like both of those albums did. It has a decently consistent track list, I guess. Consistently kind of bad, but I guess it's better than being terrible. Yeah, I mean, look, if you like Pop Genesis, if you've liked the Pop Genesis that you've heard, I think this would be a go-to album that I'd actually recommend to you. Like, I don't like it, you know, but maybe it's just not for me. Like, it is a concise track list of 80s pop songs, and it does maintain the artsier side of the band as well. They do have a 10-minute song on this thing, Domino. It's not very good, but it is there. And I don't really have much else to say about this because I can't just sit here and trash this thing. I mean, I don't think it's like that bad. It's better than the last two, so, you know, I'll give it that. So We Can't Dance is the album that brought Genesis into the 90s. This came out about 5 years after Invisible Touch, which is a pretty long time to follow up a hit album like that. You know, look, We Can't Dance is a trash album. It's a trash album, and I will explain why. But I can't really hate this one, and the reasons for that are a few things that I actually think are positive improvements about this album over the last three. For one thing, the band was more willing to integrate, I think, aspects from their prog era, which isn't to say that they write prog pop necessarily, although a few tracks, yeah. But it does mean that they inject a sort of degree of grandiosity into this sound. In general, the production of this album, for the most part anyway, is really good. It does manage a really large and kind of stadium-filling sound. And I think the opener, No Son of Mine, capitalizes on that sound quite well, with a pretty anthemic chorus and lyrics about being the child of an abusive household, and it's actually written quite nicely. The track Jesus He Knows Me even has a pretty decent chorus, to be honest. I mean, it's got its shittier groove moments and stuff, but it's got an okay chorus, and some silly lyrics mocking televangelists. I know, not exactly a difficult target to tackle, but fun enough anyway. And then the closing track, Fading Lights, is genuinely great. Like, it's actually a really good point with which to end the Phil Collins era of Genesis. And in some ways could be seen as kind of like the band's swan song. It's this 10-minute prog track, really, and the playing is great, the melodies are anthemic, and the lyrics are actually quite sad and emotionally powerful. And in general, this album tackles some different lyrical topics for the band to spice things up. It's certainly better than the absolute nonsense that were the lyrics on Invisible Touch, like on the song Driving the Last Spike, which is about the laborers who built England's railways and the kind of human cost and emotional impact of that construction. And the lyrics on that track are actually pretty okay. I mean, the song itself is pretty bland, but, you know, it's not bad, I guess. It does have one good moment towards the end of it, but, you know, it's 10 minutes long and a lot of it's just kind of like whatever. But this album takes a fucking nosedive in quality after track 3, and it signals that with one of the band's worst songs, I Can't Dance. A song that is so god-awful that before I heard Illegal Alien and Who Done It, I was saying it was among the worst songs I've ever heard. I mean, it still is, but those songs really took the cake with this band. God, I mean, the fact that they have 3 songs at this point that I would call the worst songs I've ever heard or among them, that's not good. This song doesn't even fit on the album. I mean, the lyrics are just incredibly stupid. The production is god-awful. The mix is god-awful, with Phil Collins' vocals being way too fucking loud and just sounding generally too clean. The groove the band came up with is terrible, and even the additional rhythmic elements they try to add on top of it end up just making it even worse. It is a truly god-awful song, but everything after it sucks too. They just write song after song of weak fucking tracks with bad lyrics, dull melodies, some really bad grooves like on Dreaming While You Sleep, which makes me want to puke. More faux political songs like Tell Me Why, which is just like, come on dude, you're not even trying to say anything. The production kind of falters on some of these tracks. Sometimes it's as solid as it was in the beginning, and other times it gets kind of bad, like on Since I Lost You, where the production just sounds like it came from another album. Yeah, I mean, it's just a really long track list of weak songs, of like really weak songs, of some really bad pop songs that just really suck, with some terrible lyrics, and just, you know, general awfulness. And it's like the album's well over an hour long too. Like, and I have to question if all of these tracks were even needed. Like, this track list very easily could have been cut down. It really could have. Like, did you really think all of these songs were so strong they needed to be on here? Like Living Forever, that one really needed to be on here. And it also just does feel like an album that's just generally bland and bad. Like, not even really bad in a noteworthy way outside of I Can't Dance. It's just really bad. Thankfully, I think that having a strong opening and conclusion make it a little bit more satisfying to listen to. Given that it is an hour and 10 minutes long, at least you get some reprieve, and the reprieve happens to be at the very beginning and very end, which is nice, but it doesn't make up for the amount of trash that's on this album. And yeah, I don't recommend it.
'Cause Jesus, he knows me, and he knows I'm right. I've been talking to Jesus all my life. Oh yes, he knows me, and he knows I'm right. Tell me to the Congo, I'm free to leave. There's always
Alright, you guys. I own this on CD. That's fucking hilarious. We have truly hit rock bottom. You know, Abacab, total shit. Self-titled, total shit. Invisible Touch, total shit. We Can't Dance, total shit. But they have their fans. This album? I don't think there are many people who like this album. Even fans of pop Genesis almost universally regard this as a mistake. Because that's what it is. It's a mistake. So Phil Collins left after We Can't Dance, and for some reason, Tony and Mike just thought that they could keep it going. And just in general, they've been the ones writing so many of these trash songs up to this point anyway. It really wasn't Collins. And like, now I want them to be writing without even having Collins? Look, I'm not a fan of Collins' vocals necessarily, but he wasn't bad. And he could do a damn good job on some songs. And he also made their sound, especially in their pop era. I mean, he really did. I may not like it, but he did. Why in the fuck did the band think replacing him with Ray Wilson was a good idea? Ray Wilson sounds like he belongs in a Nickelback tier post-grunge band. He doesn't belong anywhere near Genesis. And now maybe the band could have tried to reinvent their sound to suit Ray Wilson's vocals, but they don't. It's funny because this album came out in 1997. You know, that's years after even We Can't Dance, and the musical landscape had changed a lot since then. And you would think, given that Genesis was able to adapt to the musical landscape of the 80s, that they would try to do it again. But they don't. This album is awful. I mean, it's really awful. There's no redeeming qualities to this album. The production isn't very good, the drums generally sound quite shit, the singing is really bad. I mean, I'm not gonna say that Ray Wilson is a terrible singer necessarily, but he just doesn't fit any of this. And his vocals just get really grating across this album. This album's over an hour long. Fucking why? Literally in the first 5 seconds, I already want to turn it off. Like, you start this album, and it sounds god-awful. The guitar tone on the title track. What the fuck were they thinking? It sounds so bad, and this song is just so goddamn useless. It doesn't even fucking go anywhere. The synth pads just sound stupid and cheesy, the guitar is terrible, Ray Wilson's vocals are terrible, the fucking lyrics are terrible. Congo is god fucking awful. It's just such a bad pop tune. The chorus is terrible. Ray Wilson's vocals are fucking terrible. The lyrics are terrible. It's just, God. I could go on and on because I really could say the same thing about every fucking song here. The only thing that even strikes me as being moderately redeeming is the dividing line. And the only reason for that is that the drumming's pretty good on it. And I also think that there are some proggy keyboard melodies that could have worked had the band managed to create a more satisfying structure and had Tony Banks not chosen such terrible synth tones. In general, the synth tones in this album sound like they came out of a keyboard that cost $20. Why was Tony Banks playing in these tones? I don't get it. Alien Afternoon has such a god-awful and stupid groove that I genuinely can't believe the band decided to even make this song. It's so bad. Fucking Small Talk is among the band's worst tunes, probably bottom 4. It's such a bad song. It's so obnoxious and fucking stupid. What? The lyrics all across this album are god-awful. Just god-awful. They're so bad. This album ends in such a boring way. One Man's Fool is such a boring song. Like, that's the fucking finishing track on your album? And by the way, that's the finishing track to Genesis's career, apparently. Which really sucks. Like, I'm just left wondering what the hell they were even thinking with this album. Like, at least the last few, I can totally get the thought process behind it. Like, who is this supposed to even appeal to? Like, if Genesis really wanted to continue, they had a few options. They could try to adapt to the changing landscape of music and adapt their sound in a way that would appeal to new listeners, which was something that was going to be difficult, but they could have tried, especially with Ray Wilson as a vocalist, who sounds like a vocalist who might have fit in on some of the shitty alt-rock that was being made around this time, and eventually the new metal that was coming up later. But like, yeah, the band doesn't do that. They hardly even sound like they're trying to write radio hits. I mean, yeah, maybe Shipwrecked in Congo, although they are pathetic attempts, and obviously it didn't work. Another option would have been to try to appeal to the prog fan base again and try to recapture them, which is actually what they did on some of the tracks on We Can't Dance. I don't know, if that's what they were trying to do, they fucking failed miserably, but it doesn't even sound like they're trying to do that. Like, I just genuinely don't know what the goal was here. I don't know what the idea was here. It's a flop from all angles. So no wonder almost no one likes this album. There's a good reason for that. Alright, we have successfully made it through Genesis's discography, and it's been a ride. Yeah, I don't like the pop era particularly, but look, I'm willing to be fair with the strengths that it did have, and like I said, I think Duke is among the band's best work. There are ways in which I think Genesis could have gone in that direction that would have panned out a lot better than it ended up. But I mean, man, the prog era of this band, especially the Peter Gabriel-led stuff, is some of the most wonderfully creative and kind of goofy and quirky and incredible music that has ever been made. I really would say that Genesis was easily among the top tier of prog rock bands, and their sound separated itself from other bands of that time as well. And look, they managed to get 3 classics under their belt in just 3 years, and you could also argue that Nursery Cryme is a classic in some regard as well. Like, that's really impressive, and not to mention the band managed to push forward theatricality in rock concerts, and all of that stuff combines to make Genesis a band that I'm still obsessed with, one of my favorite groups for sure. You know, they made one of my favorite albums, they made my favorite all-time song, and they made other albums that I return to regularly as well because they're just amazing. And, you know, even the pop stuff obviously appealed to a lot of people at the time. Maybe not anymore, but it definitely did at the time, so you gotta give them that. It's an interesting career trajectory. It may have gone downhill in some ways, but hey, that can be fun to talk about too, so I think that's awesome. And this band is awesome, and if you haven't checked them out, you fucking should. Now stay tuned, because I'm gonna show some track ratings by album, as well as the best to worst for this band, after I say my little outro here, so bye, guys!
Push me in, turn me round, switch me on, let me go. I have a mind of my own. Outcast and trespassed where no wolf may tread, the last sacred haunt of the dead. Damp them out, we must destroy them. They infiltrate each city with their thick dark warning. There's an angel standing in the sun. And these Christian soldiers fight to protect the poor. Another time it might have been so different.
If that's what you need.